Welcome to the Agile on the Mind podcast, where we discuss how to build intelligent teams inspired by agility and the world of cognitive science. If you're listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you'll enjoy the Agile on the Mind Substack. To receive a free weekly newsletter or podcast like this with explorations of agility and cognitive science, complete with tools, tips and tricks, go to agileonthemind.substack.com. Jenny Martin is an independent trainer and facilitator in product development and innovation techniques and behaviours of high-performing teams. I met Jenny at Agile Cambridge a couple of years ago, and we hit it off and have great conversations together. So I thought it would be brilliant to invite Jenny onto the podcast to have a conversation today. Jenny works with teams of all kinds, and she helps them unlock their individual and collective potential. She is passionate about inclusivity and fascinated by all kinds of brains. Jenny recently completed a post-grad in the psychology of kindness and well-being at work, and she's a massive fan of the Lego serious play, and into anything to do with positive psychology, flourishing and personality science, which is what brings us to have this conversation here today. Jenny, welcome to Agile on the Mind.
Hello, thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Jenny, how did you get into doing what you do today?
Oh God, so by accident, I think is the best way of putting that. So I sort of fell into IT with a psychology degree back in the early 90s. There were no jobs, didn't know what I was doing, and managed to get into this consultancy firm as a tester. It's a big American IT consultancy as a tester. And I sort of rapidly progressed there, and they sent me to Dallas and boot camped me, trying to turn me into a technical person. And then I spent like 25 years accidentally working in tech. And so I, was leading teams and doing lots of big sort of project work, but always drawn to all the really collaborative stuff. When Agile became a thing and new ways of working, and I was really in there trying to get teams to properly co-create and properly work together and get rid of all those silos. So I guess I've been running workshops and trying to get teams to work well together for about 25 years. So I set up my own company nearly 15 years ago, doing training and workshop design, that kind of thing. Did a few different things on the side as well to kind of keep paying the bills. And then I guess more recently, I've been doing much more and more team stuff. So it's been like a coming back round to the psychology stuff. So when I was in this big tech company in the tech world, my psychology degree was a bit of a dirty secret because I didn't have an IT background, whereas now it's much cooler. And I sort of realised over the last 10 years that what gets me out of bed isn't really agile practices. It's much more to do with people. And so I'm doing much more of that stuff and deeply fascinated by all things personality and people and flourishing. So I love talking about myself, so I could keep going, but
It's a podcast, that's the point. It's the sad thing about hosting a podcast is I very rarely get to talk about myself, so I have to go on other people's podcasts to do that. When you were first working in teams and in IT, you said it was a dirty secret to have your psychology degree, but did that impact the way that you worked in those spaces, even if it was in secret?
I guess reflecting on it has been quite interesting because, back then the environment I was working in was completely male dominated. So all of my peers were men. I didn't even notice that I was the only woman in the room, most of the time that I was there. And I don't think it's a female thing particularly, but I've always believed that the way to lead a team is about compassion and understanding and team happiness and all of those things. And so I guess back then I was looked upon a little bit suspiciously almost because I was leading in a different way. And I had a big team, a big successful team. And so it was a bit of suspicion, what's this lady voodoo? What's this strange girly witchcraft that's going on that's giving her this weird loyal team. So back then, I know it's not like the olden days, but back then, there was much more of a kind of leave your emotions at the door. I remember being told in one of my early reviews that I would never make a senior manager because I wasn't enough of an asshole. Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. I hadn't thought of it like that. But yeah, that was a person who had my best interests at heart. So I guess that was a long answer, but I guess I've always believed about people and how important it is that people feel that their needs are being met. And I had to fight for it and get told, Jenny, it's about the business. It's not about the people. And I'd be thinking, yes, I know. Like, um, so yeah, maybe my sort of psychology background, my interest in people was seen as something that was a weakness or something a bit soft.
So we'll have time to like explore the alternative world, which is like, no, flourishing is good for businesses and things like that. But I'm curious, like, what do you think sits behind that assumption that you need to be an asshole in order to succeed, or that you can't bring in human flourishing and treat people softly and with humanity in work in order to be able to succeed in the business domain?
I think that kindness has had a stigma attached to it in a similar way that soft skills as a term has, and so been feminized throughout history, even going back to Plato. Emotions and intellect and reason, horses pulling in different directions. So that's the you can't possibly be making good decisions or be intelligent or capable without, whilst being emotional. And so this was in the 90s. Emotional intelligence was only just even becoming a thing. So, that sort of don't succumb to your emotions because you might be overwhelmed by them and that might make you weak. And I think, that's been sort of ingrained for years. And then the even in the Victorian times, the angel of the house who's meek and kind and doesn't say anything. And then you have real evidence that shows how in senior leadership, 21% of senior leaderships at the C level, this is a very, very recent global study, are psychopaths or have psychopathic traits, which is higher than the prison population. And the normal population is about 4.5%. So there's definite evidence that if you know that if you're not seen as being able to be ruthless enough, then you're not going to be able to make the difficult decisions. Um, Fortunately, I think that's changing now because we're more aware of it, and still very true in big corporate environments, big kind of competitive banking environments, that kind of thing. But hopefully changing. So yeah, definite stigma attached to it.
I'm interested in the ways in which we bring ideas unconsciously into our like how we approach these questions without even realizing. So, for example, like we may not explicitly say, I don't know, some people may explicitly say, like, emotion is not a good decision making tool. I don't want any of that. I want to be really reasonable, right? I want to use reason. And when you say something like that, you're making this distinction, which is that like emotion and all that category of stuff has nothing to do with our good decision making or our reason or anything like that. And there's just all this really good modern research about like you need to have emotions to be able to make any decisions, because you can't. There's infinite data out there, and in order to choose which data to pick from, I need to care about some of it, and I need to care emotionally. And even if it's not like a deep care, I use my emotions to choose which sets of data to choose, or intuit which arguments are better. They're not like purely logical ones and zeros and mathematical. But we haven't caught up in our sort of societal decision-making ideas with that science. We still hold these ideas of like, no, there's like rationality and there's emotion, and they're sort of often in conflict with each other.
Yeah, yeah. definitely. And it's about, I think, being able to tune into your emotions and know what they are and be able to describe them is a really important thing for reasoning. So that's the whole thing about what emotional intelligence is about, right? Being able to know what's happening and being able to separate, the fast thinking from the slow thinking in terms of your normal biases and stereotypes and your system one type thinking kicking in versus the more deliberate stuff. But of course, emotions are important in that as well, So yeah, definitely. But fortunately, it's changing now, isn't it? It's changing. There's much more discussion about how important it is to be vulnerable and be brave, and how important it is as a leader to be able to demonstrate those things in order to create the sort of safe environment that you need in order for people to flourish. So yeah, it's changing.
Can you tell us a bit about flourishing and the role of flourishing in the workplace and what you've been learning about flourishing?
Yeah, so this talking about my postgrad, it's just been so enjoyable, and it's one of those things. It literally just popped up in my social feed. This brand new postgrad in the psychology of kindness and well-being, and I thought, oh my god, I have to get a qualification in kind. It's like my calling. I have to go and do it. And it's been brilliant. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure you know about positive psychology, but just for the audience, before positive psychology, psychology was all about fixing people, right? So all of the personality disorders, anxiety, neurosis, psychopathy, exploring the sort of dysfunctional human brain. In 1990, the kind of godfather of positive psychology, Martin Seligman, coined the term positive psychology, and he was all about taking the rest of us who aren't considered to have mental illness from baseline to flourishing, and so there everything in that space is about well-being, what are the fundamental components of well-being, human psychological needs and motivation, happiness, kindness, altruism, all of the factors at play that underpin well-being. And it's been brilliant because I feel like I can wear my "I told you so" t-shirt, which is like, I knew this stuff was important, and now I've seen all the evidence. I've done all my assignments and reviewed all the latest evidence out there, that really does show that all this stuff I've learned is at the root of flourishing, rather than carrots and sticks and bullying and all of those things that some of us have been subject to in the past.
Were there any intuitions that you had about flourishing, about kindness, that were making their way into your work, and then you learned a concept or you learned about an experiment or something where you're like, right, I knew that was a thing, but now there's like more language, or there's sort of, I don't know, evidence or more exploration behind it?
Yes, actually. So I was always a fan, before I did my postgrad, of any sort of strength-based intervention. So there's loads of them out there. There's Strength Scope, Gallup Strengths Finder, DISC. There's loads of them. Some of them I'm kind of interested in more than others, but I I really like the idea that, and this is what I believe, that we're all perfectly formed as we are. We just need to find the right environment to flourish in. And that's different for everybody because we need that variation in personality to evolve. Whereas we spend a lot of time trying to fix ourselves and trying to be well-rounded. And so what I like about the strengths-based stuff is about how we can recognise that we're all individual, we all have these wonderful, unique strengths. And what we need in teams is well-rounded teams rather than well-rounded people. So I particularly liked the Strengths Finder because where you have 34 strengths that you figure out from doing this online test, what appealed to me was that the likelihood of someone else having the same top 5 as you was 1 in 33 million, which I really like, because I don't like to be put in a box. So the thing from, I guess, the thing from the course was that is one of the most impactful things you can do in an organisation and with teams to increase well-being, is when teams understand their strengths and work at getting better at things they're already good at, because they're much more likely to stand out and to be happy and to feel engaged. Also, understanding each other's strengths, which is a real cornerstone for any kind of communication training or team dynamics, because once you understand other people's strengths, you can also recognize how they complement you. And the other thing with it, which is really interesting, is that, you know, we're all a factor of our genetics and our environment and all of that kind of stuff, and we project our expectations onto other people based on how we are. So if you're naturally good at something, you can't imagine what it's like not to naturally be good at that, and so we often feel disappointed by other people. And so when you spend time figuring out the strengths of other people, you can also forgive them more easily about the things they're not good at. So yeah, I spent a lot of time learning about that.
And presumably that kind of thing is quite like tool agnostic, right? It doesn't matter if I use Strength Finder or DISC or this or that. The important thing is like the framing of, am I trying to make up for my deficiencies at work or in life, or am I trying to put myself in situations where I get to play to my strengths? And then how you identify and name, this is at least my assumption, correct me if I'm wrong, would be that, yeah, which particular tool you use or which words you use for it isn't as important as that switch.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there is, in some of the kind of limitations and downsides of any of the strengths-based tools, any of the ones where somebody feels categorized has got a lower kind of effectiveness because people reject being categorized. And I guess the other drawback is if they're too specific and if you're too much expecting for these to be your things that are static. If you think they're static, then it can lead to a kind of lack of willingness to develop in other areas. But yeah, there's one that I've been using called Strong Suits, which I'm on about all over LinkedIn, which I particularly like because it doesn't even involve a test. It's just a pack of cards and you can use those. So I like that because you're not doing a psychometric test. And the evidence shows that people are just as good at figuring out their own strengths with the strengths themselves written in front of them than they are being asked abstract questions and pair questions. So it's just as effective.
Yeah, because I think with all this kind of like tools for finding the names of things, like it activates my like skeptical side of like, well, hang on, like how rigorous is that, or like what do you mean all these categories, or does this not move? It produces a resistance in me. And I remember a few years ago I was working with a group and we did one of these strengths finder type exercises. I think it was based on MBTI, the Myers-Briggs traits.
Oh yes, yeah.
In whatever I stands for there, inference, initiation. And I was like having a go at the facilitator, being like, well, I don't know if this is true, or is it this or that? And he said like, just like, let's hear what each other have to say and like take it all with a pinch of salt. And I said, like, I think I went first, and I was like, well, mine are, like, I like to, like, speak first, and I like to, like, have ideas with lots of other people, and I like to do all this stuff. Like, surely everyone wants these, right? And everyone else in the room was like, absolutely not. I really like to be quiet by myself, and I do my best work, like, not pressured, and, like, I love meeting deadlines. And it was really, like, a watershed moment for me of, like, oh, other people aren't, the things that I value about myself, which are, like, useful and have their place, aren't just, like, universal truths. Like there are other ways of being, which I was probably too old when I discovered that, but it was really useful. And that tool, even if it had its like methodological whatevers, allowed that conversation to happen, and it was much easier for that group to say to each other, well, if I like working alone and you like working in groups, how are we going to be together, and how are we going to make them, we can negotiate that, sort of having articulated the starting points. So I'm more of a convert to these things than I once was. Yeah.
I felt the same about Myers-Briggs, to be honest. There's a lot of criticism about it. It's sort of widely scorned upon now. And yeah, you get like one of 16 boxes that is very, very specific about how you are, and I certainly didn't like that labelling either. But yeah, there's been a lot more research about strengths and the value of those sorts of things since then, and there's drawing from loads more different aspects of positive psychology as well, around social styles and communication styles and all of that good stuff.
Can you tell us a bit about those things, social styles, communication styles?
Yeah, I guess the DISC profile talks about communication styles being either across kind of two scales, one being people focused versus task focused, and another scale being expressive versus reflective. And you could sort of plot your preferred communication style anywhere across those two axes. It does kind of change a little bit, so that's quite interesting. One of the most interesting parts, one of the most interesting psychologists that I just loved what he was talking about was a man called Daniel Hoffman. And he talks about strengths as core qualities, and he calls them gifts from the universe, right? Your core qualities are your gifts from the universe. And he describes how almost everything we see in ourselves and other people, which is considered a weakness or something bad or difficult or annoying, is too much of something. So too much of something good. And that he said that comes with your strength for free. And that's your pitfall. So I'm a really trusting person and a kind of a generous person. And so if I'm too trusting, I kind of get my gullibleness for free, right? I get my gullibleness for free. I'm a good communicator, which is a strength. I get my talking too much for free. Yeah. So he talks about these core quadrants, but he also talks about opposing and challenging strengths. So the easiest example of that might be detail versus big picture. Yeah, or it might be firmness versus agreeableness. And he cites these as kind of opposite things. And he talks about how we tend to be drawn to people that have a character trait which is the opposite one, when they're both good, both showing up good, right? So if my kindness is showing up as being tolerant and kind, and somebody else's critique or is being measured, then the two of those together is going to give a really, really good result. But if my kindness is overplayed and I become a walkover or a people pleaser, and this firmness over here is overplayed and becomes shouty or aggressive, those two are totally incompatible. And so what looked nice suddenly goes really bad. And so he uses this to explain all kinds of relationships and marriages and things, and how, the very people that you get drawn to are the same, if you can't live with their overplayed strength, then you're onto a losing kind of relationship. So yeah, there's so many things in there. You're asking me about these different factors. There's things about opposing strengths. There's things about overplayed strengths being, the good thing coming out too much. There's communication styles, and then social styles, which is a little bit different. And all same with personality profiles. So there's packed in with loads of different strands coming from positive psychology. Did that answer your question?
Beautifully. Especially, I love the way that and these are sort of like philosophical questions in a way, or they're like philosophical starting points that then sort of lend themselves to scientific inquiry. Or it's like, hey, I wonder if taking this starting point that like opposing strengths is a marker of a healthy relationship or something, maybe that will give us a pattern to look for in social relationships. And like it's one of these things where I wonder if trying to be scientific about it kind of gets in the way of like the strength of the idea. Because again, like when we're doing science, we're doing if we're doing it well, it should be critical, it should be excluding hypotheses, it should be rigorous, it should be like quite slow and methodical and cold, and even about like things like kindness, and that reduces our ability to, I don't know, to use useful concepts like that and to really explore them and to really see how we gel with them. Because if I'm resistant to the idea of like me having a particular, I'm really sort of boundaried and I'm with someone that's really like giving, and if I'm like, well, no, there's no way those two things can be blending well, or there's no way those things can be synergistic. That's the word I was looking for. Well, then I miss the opportunity to like build partnerships with people like that, or to make the most of that, or to see past the free gift, or something like that.
And it's the same. It's the same within us, right? So it's quite likely that if you were using some of these strengths-based tools, you might find out that you had two opposing strengths as part of your top 5 or whatever, which you might think is a bit weird. When that happens, it's almost like showing you that you've almost got a superpower, right? So if I'm resilient and sensitive, and I can be sensitively resilient and resiliently sensitive, and they're kind of opposing, then I'm managing that really, really well. And so you know, the same exists within us, being able to build those things and having those things that come naturally.
I think I'm experiencing a version of that right now, because I've got maybe my sort of truth-seeking, like, no, that's not scientifically rigorous, everything needs to be like provable with data, and I'm like critique and pick holes. And when it comes to a lot of this personality related psychology stuff, it's really easy for me to like fall into that mode. But then I have like another one which is like seeker and open and like and wants to bring in different ideas and blend them and and I'm finding like even in this moment sort of trying to manage those things within myself. And I think like you talked about self-awareness and emotional awareness at the beginning. This is going to sound like a really self-indulgent thing to say, but it's my podcast, so anyone that's listening has signed up for that. That feels like a healthy thing to be able to recognize and go like, I don't need to worry about, we can explore the ideas and what's available here without like sacrificing truth or rigor. And sometimes we can spend time in rigor, but without also sacrificing the whole picture. And I think that's, I don't know, I find that an interesting framing. Yeah.
I have a science bias as well, hugely, which is why I reject some of the Myers-Briggs stuff and some of the other kind of more psychoanalysis-y type coming from that part of psychology rather than the very evidence-based stuff. So, I mean, when we look at personality science, I guess most of the theory about personality is coming back to the big 5 personality traits, which has been very well researched and evidenced, and you know, to the extent that you know, aspects of personality can be observed in DNA. You know, that you have extrovert octopuses and anxious or neurotic great tits, or you know, so it's
often.
So yeah, there's a lot of sort of factor analysis and all of that stuff has gone into identifying all of those different strands of personality which are independent from each other, and it's the munging all of those and the scales of all of those which comes up with these personality traits.
What are the big 5 ones for those?
So the big 5, it spells ocean, and so this has been stable for years, since like the 60s, I think. Let's see if I can get this right. So ocean, O is openness. So that's the extent to which it's not about how much you share about yourself. It's about how open you are to your environment. So how curious you are, how influenced you are by your environment. If you're extremely high on openness, you might be verging on having some kind of bipolar type condition, hearing voices and things like that. That could be an extreme propensity to be influenced by your environment or to notice things. So openness is the O. C is conscientiousness, so the extent to which you are in control and mastering your environment versus overwhelmed by it, how organised you are, how tidy you are, all of that kind of stuff. E is extroversion, introversion, which has of course been around for years, very, very well researched. OCA. A is agreeableness. So agreeableness is one of these things that will come out in terms of being strong in relationships, kindness, altruism, avoiding conflict, all of those things, how agreeable you are. And the last one is neurosis, how neurotic you are. And so those 5 things have been really stable supporting personality science and are evidence in the animal kingdom as well. And where you are on each scale equals your kind of personality profiling.
What's the opposite of neurotic?
Well, I guess, unneurotic.
So what would be a good working definition of?
Confident. So neurotic would be anxious, catastrophizing, lacking in confidence, shy, whereas lack of neurosis would be calm, confident, all of those things, control over you're not expecting bad things to happen, lack of paranoia. So you can imagine that if you're high on neurosis and low on agreeableness and low on conscientiousness, you get a profile of somebody that's struggling with world. Yeah.
Are they necessarily in trade-off with each other? Can I be high in all of them?
Yeah, you could be. Yeah, the factor analysis and the data crunching across those 5 things has identified them being separate from each other. So there's no relationship between them. They are discrete attributes of personality.
So I'm wondering, because part of the hypothesis of Agile on the Mind is that your mind is a team and your team is a mind. If I'm being pithy about it, I'll let other people decide if I'm being pithy about it. But just like our minds consist of different qualities and, like we said, opposing forces, and our ability to integrate those effectively towards achieving whatever we want to achieve in our life, that probably represents something like intelligence or wisdom or flourishing or something like that. So my mind consists of all these different bits, and so too my team together composes or composes, I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but makes up a kind of mind themselves, between all these different people with all their different preferences and all their different styles and histories and things like that. So I was wondering, what would it look like to map Ocean onto a team and say, is this a neurotic team in that they catastrophize and think about things going wrong? Is this an extrovert team in that they put themselves out there, explore new ideas? Is this a conscientious team in that they think about getting everything in order? And there might be different types of team that would have very different profiles adaptively, in a good way, right? We would want our information security team to be kind of neurotic, kind of conscientious, and maybe not some of the others or something like that. Whereas we would want our sexy innovation team coming up with new fangled stuff to be less neurotic and more let's just go and try it and who cares and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And that's what fascinates me about all these strengths-based approaches, because you absolutely can just do an Ocean test, right? It's been around for ages. You can look it up online and do the 15 questions or whatever to get your Ocean score, and you can do that as a team. Now, all of these strengths-based stuff that I've been talking about are just an extension of that, right? They're just an extension of that with more with combinations of things, honed on different scales, coming up with these different strengths. So that's absolutely what's brilliant about using these strengths in a team. So all the things you just talked about in the tool that I use, which is the strong suits, there's things in there like curious, there's curiosity, there's things in there like detail, big picture, things about how innovate, and so they show up all of these different things. And you can play with the cards, not just to figure out, okay, what am I like today? What are my top sort of strengths that are coming out? Or what are my communication styles that are coming out? But you could sit down as a team and say, what do we need for this particular challenge? I was running a session, a strong suit session with a colleague a couple of months ago, and it was quite transformational for one of the attendees because they said, I've got caution in my top 5. I've never thought of that as a strength. I've never thought of that as a strength. It's something that I felt has been holding me back. You're too cautious, and here it is as a strength. And I was like, well, yeah, if I needed somebody to come and run my nuclear power plant, I'd want them to have caution, right? And that's what I love about it, is that you can see all of those things as strengths, and you can recognise what you need from a team, for the team to be well-rounded rather than the individual, which is a much healthier thing.
It also offers a perspective that I like, which is when you've got a dysfunction, if you're in the position of the kind of work that we do, which is maybe coaching, maybe holding space for teams, finding ways to see that dysfunction as a misfiring of something that is adaptive, right? So, we can never get anything done. It's like, yeah, because you've hired a bunch of really cautious people who are doing their job well most of the time if they're being cautious. So no wonder they don't love your cool new disruptive idea. They're cautious. You want them to be cautious. You don't want them to let go of that. Maybe you want them to let go of that sometimes, in which case, as the facilitator, you need to create a space where your cautious person, who you definitely want to be in your organization doing cautious work, has permission, tools, space, encouragement, rules of the game, encourage them to let go of their caution for a moment, and makes that feel safe, because that person has developed that for a reason, and we don't want to just punish them or think they're being difficult unnecessarily.
Yeah, exactly. It gives you a language to have really difficult conversations, to approach certain behaviours, to deal with conflict. So yeah, I use any kind of strengths-based approach as a foundational step before doing any training on feedback or non-violent communication or conflict resolution or communication. Once you've got the understanding that we're all different and we all have different strengths, it's a really useful step into that.
Yeah, it's really nice. It's a pattern that I'm noticing. I'm just thinking, I had a conversation with Caitlin Walker, who does clean language, and will start off her, and systemic modelling. She starts off her systemic modelling with a similar kind of activity, not in the same way as you're describing, where we sort of look for where people fit within some predefined categories. Is that a fair way of saying it? But rather people using their own metaphors and describing their system to each other in their own language, which then can form that foundation. But these approaches have in common, let's show the system to itself as it is, either through where you fit on ocean or strengths or something like that, or in your own metaphors. And then we can have harder conversations about the specific issues that we're facing once we see each other and once we have that perspective that I'm not just dealing with myself here.
And as I was preparing for some of my assignments on my post-grad, there was, I can't quote the research or remember it, but the importance of storytelling and narrative, that as a person, as part of a team, you have a narrative which is your view of yourself and your story, and how important it is that other people understand that. Particularly, they were saying, when somebody's being hired into an organisation and they're connecting with the identity of the organisation, and in that onboarding period, they feel like they need to have a narrative and be understood as a person. So that research was looking at the benefit of doing these strengths-based stuff as part of a hiring process and how it builds the connection with the organisation. So yeah, I love Caitlin's stuff as well. The clean feedback stuff is the stuff I'm more familiar with than the clean language, but yeah.
One other thing I wanted to pick up on before we move into kindness and feedback and non-violent communication, which I do want to talk about, is you mentioned that it's not just about the team being static in terms of their profile or profiles for this kind of thing, but it's also sort of task related. We're a cautious team and we have to do something's being plopped in front of us where that caution will get in the way. How do you handle a situation like that where the team organism as it's set up is not well adapted between them for that kind of work? How do you approach a situation like that?
I think that's what makes these tools and these different applications interesting, right? As a coach, to be able to inspect it and reflect, and then get the team to figure out what's going on themselves. And so that sometimes leads to a gap of a certain type of person in a team, but it often might lead to just some changes in behaviours and some challenges and stretching based on how, the normal paradigms or the normal biases that they have. So I think any ways that we are able to create an environment where people can be curious about each other and also themselves and develop that self-awareness, it's got to be a good thing. So yeah, I'm sure there's millions of different tools that I've never heard of that help with that kind of thing as well.
But the essential starting point is like, let's name it, give it language, talk about it, be able to have this, and then we have... Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah. Where does kindness fit into this?
Oh, so kindness is a really multifaceted concept. So it's quite hard to define because it's a personality trait, it's a state of mind, it's a point of view, it's a cognition. There's so many different parts to it. So looking into the research around kindness is quite a new thing. So even defining it. So there's elements of, it's all sitting under pro-social behaviour, but within there you've got empathy and altruism and generosity and benevolence, and there's tons of things that are similar but not the same. You're definitely born with a propensity, I think. That's what I believe based on my understanding of personality science. And I guess one of the challenges with it is that there's different scales to it. So we looked at a piece of new research trying to define kindness and actually break it down as to what it is. And I'll try and be a human graph, right? So on one axis...
Whilst also bearing in mind that some of our listeners might be just listeners, so we'll have to describe the graph as well.
Yeah, I'll describe the graph as well. So on one axis is whether the kindness is socially prescribed or whether it's coming from your empathy, coming from your, how sort of empathetic you are. And the other one is to do with how proactive you are. So whether it's, a proactive thing or whether it's something you just think that you should do. So if it's things like manners, like opening a door, picking up something from the floor, would be a not particularly proactive, socially driven form of kindness, if that makes sense. If you were going further and you joined your local community to go and picking up litter, it's still probably coming from a place of, this is what I've been taught and grown up to know that this is a good thing to do for the community, but it's a bit more proactive. And then on the more emotional scale, this is what we're talking about in terms of emotions and how helpful they are. There's the genuine empathy and the genuine need to respond. On the kind of less proactive side would be, oh, I can see that you're upset. The right thing for me to do, and I feel it as well, is be sympathetic and give you a hug and be here for you. On the more kind of proactive scale, that's when kindness is coming at a cost. So you're normally giving up something. You're normally putting yourself at risk or losing out on something. So an example of that might be, oh, I was going to go away with the girls this weekend, but I'm going to go and help my auntie move house because she needs help. I'm going to volunteer, even though I'm missing out on that and it's going to be my own free time. So you can see those like 4 quadrants, if you can imagine them. And then right in the middle of that, which is supposed to be the most sort of innate, truest form of kindness, is this thing called anthropophilia, which is a new word. It doesn't exist. If you Google it, it doesn't exist. Yeah, it only exists in these papers, which were only published last year. You can find anthropic, which is about blood-sucking insects which prefer humans. So of course anthropophy is about humans and loving humans. Yeah, so that's how it kind of breaks down in the Latin. And so this middle bit is the true kindness, is called anthropophilia. And in terms of all of the characteristics that exhibits, it's pretty much the opposite of psychopathy, where you'd be lacking in empathy, lacking in agreeableness, not prone to that instinctive, emotional-based reaction and care and altruism. So I found that bit really, really, really fascinating, because I realised that, I was talking about my lady witchcraft and my sort of kind, compassionate approach to leading. I've come across some people at the opposite end of that, let me just say, based on what I said. And now I realise how I must have been their nemesis, their mirror, and how that got me into trouble, because I'd be there fiercely standing up for somebody, putting myself in harm's way, trying to do the right thing, and, getting a really extreme reaction from that other person. So I found that really interesting. So that's a bit of science about kindness.
It's cool that it's also so new and emergent, and like, I don't know, my initial thinking is like kindness is also going to be really contextual, right? So like, it's very rarely kind to like give someone a sedative and cut them open, unless like they need some life-saving operation, in which case it is a kind of kindness to be able to cause them pain or to something like that. And equally, like giving someone, I don't know, difficult feedback that they need to hear that would help them, if it's done well, maybe this like segues us into feedback and stuff like that, maybe that's the right thing to do. And then sometimes kindness is treating people like really caringly and really softly and things like that. And like, which of those is kindness? Well, it depends on the situation, it depends on everything.
Yeah. And I think that's I mean, I really like what you said there, because I think some of the stigma and some of the, where people maybe think has two sides, or you can be too kind, is to do with niceness rather than kindness. And this is something I've been talking about this year. And so, nice normally sits on that sort of socially prescribed side, compared to kind, which true kindness mostly comes at a cost. Either your ego or your time or money or whatever it is. It normally comes at a cost. And to do that, imagine me like fiercely standing up to this big bad boss. That's hard, and it requires courage. It's certainly not soft, and it's not easy. And it can require being really, really brave. And that's, I think that learning about this and understanding it has really made me realise what was going on for me during those times, in terms of this sort of moral fight for something, coming from somewhere really within me, and not understanding why other people didn't behave in the same way. And there's so I've been doing a bit of reading, and I'm sure you've heard of Brené Brown and her leadership stuff, and she talks about how important vulnerability is in leadership, and how you can't be vulnerable without being brave, and vice versa. And she talks about kind being clear and unkind being unclear. And so when we talk about unclear, that could be passive aggressive behaviour, where you're trying to be polite and you're not actually being direct and saying what you mean. It might be avoiding a difficult conversation, even though it's the right thing to do, because you don't want to upset the harmony. Or it could be, or passive aggressiveness. All of these things come from that need to try and not rock the boat or to be too direct. And then there's one thing that I love, which I wish I'd heard of this term earlier, which is the dirty yes, which is where you say yes in a meeting. Oh, yes, Dan, that's a great idea. Yeah, we'll go with that. And then later on, out of sight, the no comes out. And so kindness is about being direct, right? And the hard conversation and all of those things that you talked about. giving somebody really difficult feedback, even letting somebody go from an organisation because it's not right for anybody, or putting yourself out there because it's the right thing to do, even though it might be putting your job in danger. That's kind.
How does one become more kind, especially in the workplace?
So I think kindness in the workplace is to do with seeking to understand before being understood. Everything we just talked about in terms of strengths helps us do that. Feedback, I guess we'll talk about in a minute, in terms of separating out judgment from observation, which is really important in order to have difficult conversations. Trying not to judge each other, which is quite challenging, quite difficult to do. We do a lot of judgment in our words, normal words that we use. Play kindness forward. So we tend to reward results, and we tend to not reward behaviours enough. And you've probably heard of the ripple effect of kindness. If you go and be kind to somebody, then they probably go, oh, I might go and just be kind to somebody else, and it sort of spreads.
Especially with that difficult kindness, especially where it's like the sort of taking the plaster off, like, oh, I'm glad that person could like have that conversation with me and told me the thing that needed to be said. Okay, like that gives a permission for that kind of thing to be done.
Yeah. And it's one of those neuroplasticity things as well, in terms of, I've forgotten the name for the bit of your brain responsible for empathy and kindness, right in the centre. But the more you work it, the more it develops. So, being kind makes you kinder. And there's I mean, it's good for you as well, oxytocin and all. Have you heard about the, am I going to get this right? Do you know about telomeres?
Assume I don't know about telomeres. I'm a
Okay,
nerd, but...
No. So, our chromosomes, right? If you imagine this X-shaped chromosome responsible for all of our cell functioning and carrying all our DNA and dividing all over the place, dividing to renew cells. These telomeres have got little booties, right? They've got little booties at the end. Sorry, these chromosomes have got these booties called telomeres. And these telomeres are these little things at the ends of the legs of the chromosomes that stop them from getting tangled up when they divide or sticking together. And so every time a cell divides, the telomeres get a little bit smaller. And there's a recent study that showed that the group practicing loving kindness meditation, as opposed to other styles of meditation, and a control group, their telomeres didn't get any shorter at all during the period of the study, whereas every other group saw normal aging telomere shortening, which suggests that kindness is good for aging at a genetic level, which is amazing.
I'll allow my it's both amazing, and I'll allow my scientific rigor person to be like, emphasis on the suggests. He feels a lot better.
It's statistically significant.
It's also fascinating. Yeah, it's also fascinating. Yeah.
I'll show you. I'll send you the study. It's really interesting.
I'll link it in the show notes. Yeah, that stuff is fascinating. Like, there's I've been listening to a lot of the Mind and Life podcast recently, and it's people bringing Buddhist contemplative traditions in conversation with science and contemplative science and cognitive science and things like that, and trying to work out, what is the impact of these kind of studies. I imagine they're like in the same world of trying to work out what are the impacts of various kinds of contemplative practices and contemplative traditions, and what do they do physiologically to us, and does it matter, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
studies involving. Thank you for allowing. I'll say thank you for allowing that little pedant in me to like have his voice. I couldn't.
Yeah, no. I mean, there's these Buddhist monks feature quite a lot in some of this kindness research.
We haven't spoken about. You mentioned we use a lot of judgments in our words. So maybe as like a sort of closing topic here, like, can you tell us a bit about the ways in which we are sometimes judgmental without realizing, and how that might link to non-violent communication and things like that, especially when we're giving feedback.
Yeah, so well, non-violent communication has been around since the 70s. It's been around for ages. A man called Marshall Rosenberg, who was a clinical psychiatrist working out of Detroit, with quite a lot of conflict, quite a lot of difficult kind of environment that he was operating in, and he did lots of mediation, lots of therapy and all sorts of things like that. And so his method of non-violent communication is separated out into basically 4 steps. The first one is observations, so separating out observation for judgments, which is essentially saying, I noticed actions, what you said, what you did, rather than you are. Anything that starts with you is likely to come with a judgment, unless it's you said.
Or you did,
or you did, yeah, exactly.
Observable.
The second part is about emotions. We were talking about emotional intelligence. The second part is being able to name your emotions and know what they are. So quite often we confuse emotions with thoughts, and we justify our language by saying "I feel" in front of it, even though the thing we're about to say isn't a feeling at all. So I feel undervalued. Right? That's not a feeling at all. In fact, it's pointing the finger at somebody else, saying you don't value me. But we get used to using this language, I feel, and we think that gives us permission to say the thing.
Especially when it's like, I feel like you're angry with me. Like, feeling like someone with angry with you is not a feeling.
Yeah.
What is? Oh, a product manager I worked with a while ago gave me a really good clue here, which was like, whenever you say I feel like, you're probably not saying an emotion.
Yes, yeah.
Or I feel
exactly.
that. You're not saying an emotion. You are saying an opinion, and you're calling it a feeling. What is a feeling?
Yeah, which is a thought. Yeah, so which is a thought. So whereas the feelings, they come from the genuine fight or flight emotions, so angry, sad, happy, and versions of those. So disappointed is still a bit sad, or frustrated is a bit sad, but they're still emotions. And so the non-violent communication is getting you to actually figure out, what was the emotion? What was it? Was it disappointment? Was it hurt? Was it anger? And then think about, okay, so what did that lead me to think? Because there's the judgment. There's the translation where your stereotypes and biases and everything else kicks in. The next part of nonviolent communication is about needs. So you recognize what you need. This comes back to our psychological needs. So it might be that you needed relatedness, or you needed autonomy, or you needed to feel in control of the situation, to be in control of the situation. It might be that you needed something like that. So it's figuring out then what you need. And it's often a quick way to calm any conflict by saying, what do you need? It's a way of just calming it down. And then the final part of it is how you can, the request that you make of the other person in terms of, would you be able to? And so, yeah, there's more to it than that. But if you look at most decent feedback models, there's an element of separating out what you noticed from what you judged, and then doing some good listening, and then figuring out what the needs are and what was going on, and then making some kind of agreement. So most feedback models are based on that non-violent communication stuff.
Maybe as an ending salvo, if you would be willing to, do you have any non-violent communication style feedback for this episode of Agile on the Mind that you would like to share? You can say
God. No. Certainly there would be no violent feedback.
We can interpret what a violent version of that might be.
I've enjoyed it. Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about, it's the same with positive feedback, right? It's the same in that often we're not specific enough, or we don't let the, and we're not clear about the impact or anything like that. So if I was being appreciative, I'd say, Daniel, I really enjoyed today's podcast because I felt I was able to have a really nourishing conversation with you and talk about all my favourite things in an environment which, was safe for me to do that without worrying about having a menopausal slip of the tongue and saying something silly. And that the impact on me is that I'm going to leave here feeling all warm and fuzzy, enjoying my dinner, and be looking forward to hearing what your next podcast is. Yeah.
Lovely.
So that's feedback.
Yeah. I think there's something really nice there about this is also about positive feedback as well, right? Like when you said that, I felt like happy, reassured, safe, warm, excited.
Yeah.
Like I have a need which you met. Please keep doing it. Like and it doesn't just
And I have a need.
horrible stuff.
I have a need, I know, deep in me about being appreciated and having space and so I feel that need's been met. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm really happy to hear that. When you told me that need was met, I felt warm and fuzzy, and I felt appreciated. I felt like basky, and I have a need to I don't know, feel appreciated, feel seen. Please keep coming on the Agile on the Mind podcast as you complete subsequent postgraduate qualifications. Jenny Martin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. See you again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Agile on the Mind podcast. I've been your host, Daniel Susser, and a big thank you to our guest, Jenny Martin, who joined us this week. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more or read more about agility, cognitive science, and building high-performing intelligent teams, you can sign up to the Agile on the Mind Substack, agileonthemind.substack.com. You'll get a free weekly email with a blog or a podcast or some musings or something like that into your email inbox. You can unsubscribe at any time, and it is free to subscribe. So we'll see you there, and we'll see you next time on the Agile on the Mind podcast.